We've all seen the Viking longhouse in popular culture. The great wooden halls stretching hundreds of feet across the Nordic landscape, their peaked roofs crowned with carved dragon heads. Smoke rising from central hearths, where warriors gather around roaring fires to share tales of conquest and glory. Hollywood shows us these magnificent structures as symbols of Viking prosperity and community warm, welcoming spaces where extended families lived together in harmony, where honored guests were received with hospitality, where the spoils of successful raids were celebrated in grand feasts that lasted for days. The romantic image persists in our collective imagination. Noble warriors returning from overseas adventures, bringing exotic treasures and foreign wives to share in their good fortune. We picture Viking women welcoming these newcomers into their households, teaching them Norse customs, helping them adapt to their new lives in the north. The Longhouse represents civilization, order, and the triumph of Viking culture over the chaos of the outside world. But what actually happened when the Longhouse doors closed behind the captive women? What was the reality of life inside these structures for the thousands of women who were dragged from their homelands and forced into Viking domestic life? What did the archaeological evidence, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts reveal about the true purpose and function of these supposedly magnificent halls? The answer is so systematically horrifying that it challenges everything we think we know about Viking society, about the nature of medieval domestic life, and about the very concept of home itself. The Longhouse wasn't a symbol of civilization. It was a carefully designed machine for the systematic destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. This isn't historical speculation based on feminist interpretation of ambiguous evidence. What we're about to uncover is documented in excruciating detail through multiple independent sources spanning 3 centuries of Viking expansion. The archaeological record from Longhouse excavations across Scandinavia reveals architectural features specifically designed for human imprisonment and systematic abuse. Legal codes preserved in medieval manuscripts provide explicit instructions for the management and exploitation of captive women within domestic settings. Eyewitness accounts from Arab merchants, Christian missionaries, and Byzantine diplomats describe the horrific realities they observed firsthand in Viking homes. The evidence comes from sites stretching from Iceland to Russia, from Ireland to the Baltic states, wherever Viking raiders established permanent settlements and built their characteristic longhouses. The pattern is consistent across cultures, time periods, and geographic locations. The systematic transformation of domestic architecture into instruments of oppression and the development of household management systems that reduced human beings to livestock. The question isn't whether this happened. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. The written documentation is explicit, and the legal frameworks are preserved in comprehensive detail. The question is how an entire civilization developed such sophisticated methods for the systematic brutalization of captive women under the guise of normal domestic life. How did family homes become prison camps? How did household management become systematic torture? How did the most basic human institution, the home, become a machine for destroying human dignity? The archaeological evidence begins with the physical structure of the longhouses themselves. Modern excavations at sites like Borg in the Lofoten Islands, Tiso in Denmark, and Gamla Uppsala in Sweden have revealed that these structures were far more complex than the simple family homes depicted in popular culture. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation have uncovered extensive underground complexes connected to the main halls by hidden passages, specialized chambers with specific architectural features designed for human confinement, and sophisticated drainage and ventilation systems that served purposes far removed from normal domestic needs. At Borg, the largest Viking longhouse ever discovered, archaeologists have uncovered a complex that stretches over 270 feet in length and includes multiple underground levels that were completely hidden from casual view. The main hall, which could accommodate several hundred people, sits above a maze of chambers, tunnels, and specialized rooms that were specifically designed for holding and processing large numbers of captive women. The architectural sophistication rivals that of modern prison facilities, with security features, monitoring systems, and specialized equipment that reveals the true purpose of these domestic spaces. Chemical analysis of soil samples from these underground chambers reveals high concentrations of human blood, urine, feces, and other bodily fluids, along with traces of exotic spices and perfumes that isotope analysis indicates were imported from the captives' homelands. The combination suggests these spaces were used for systematic abuse that incorporated psychological torture, designed to destroy connections to the captives' former lives and identities. The specialized chambers reveal even more disturbing evidence. At Tiso, excavations have uncovered rooms with iron rings set into the walls at precise intervals corresponding to human height and reach, drainage channels cut into the floor that could handle large quantities of liquid, and ventilation systems that could introduce various airborne substances. Tool marks on the stone walls are consistent with systematic torture, while chemical residue analysis reveals the use of acids and other substances that would cause severe pain without permanent damage that might affect the captive's economic value. Perhaps most revealing are the discoveries at Gamla Uppsala, where ground-penetrating radar has revealed a vast underground complex that housed specialized facilities for different aspects of captive management. The chambers include what appear to be medical facilities for maintaining the captives' health and fertility, workshops where they were forced to produce goods for trade, breeding facilities designed to maximize reproductive efficiency, and disposal areas where those who died were processed to avoid contaminating the living spaces above. The written evidence provides even more comprehensive documentation of what happened inside these longhouses. The most detailed accounts come from the legal codes preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts, particularly the Gragas and the Frostathing Law, which contain explicit instructions for the domestic management of captive women. These laws weren't dealing with abstract legal principles. They were practical manuals for the day-to-day operation of household slavery systems that had been refined through generations of practice. The Gragas contains an entire section devoted to household management of foreign women, which provides step-by-step instructions for every aspect of their treatment, from initial arrival to eventual disposal. The laws specify that captive women were to be housed in underground chambers to prevent escape attempts and to hide their presence from casual visitors who might report on Viking practices to foreign authorities. They were to be provided with minimal food calculated to maintain their health and fertility, while keeping them weak enough to prevent resistance. The legal codes specified different categories of captive women based on their perceived value and intended use. Breeding stock consisted of young women from noble or wealthy families who were designated for systematic sexual exploitation to produce children with potential inheritance claims in their homelands. Work stock included older women, or those from common backgrounds, who were assigned to various forms of forced labor. Training stock consisted of young girls who were being prepared for eventual sale in international slave markets. Contemporary eyewitness accounts provide first-hand documentation of the horrific realities inside Viking longhouses. The Arab merchant Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who traveled extensively through Viking territories in the 10th century, describes visiting what he initially believed were normal family homes, only to discover underground complexes where dozens of captive women were held in conditions that shocked even someone familiar with the slave markets of the Islamic world. Ibn Fadlan's account describes systematic sexual abuse conducted with industrial efficiency, organized breeding programs that treated human beings like livestock, and systematic psychological torture designed to break the spirits of captives who showed any signs of resistance. His observations are particularly valuable because he approached them from the perspective of someone who was himself involved in the slave trade, yet was horrified by the systematic nature and sheer scale of what he witnessed in Viking domestic settings. Even more detailed are the accounts of Rimbert, the Christian missionary who spent years living among the Vikings in the 9th century. His writings preserved in the Vita and Scari, describe the systematic integration of captive women into Viking household economies through methods that violated every principle of Christian morality. Rimbert describes witnessing the systematic rape of captive women as a form of household entertainment, the forced breeding of children who were immediately separated from their mothers, and the systematic psychological conditioning designed to make captives grateful for their abuse. Byzantine sources provide additional documentation from the eastern trade routes, where Viking merchants would transport captive women who had been processed in longhouse facilities to international slave markets. The Byzantine chronicler Constantine Porphyrogenitus describes meeting these women and being struck by their systematic psychological destruction. They had been so thoroughly broken that they no longer remembered their own names, their families, or even their homelands. But perhaps most chilling are the saga accounts written by the Vikings themselves. The Laxdæla saga, the Egil's saga, and the Heimskringla all contain detailed descriptions of longhouse life that, when read with an understanding of the legal and social context, become instruction manuals for domestic human trafficking. The sagas describe the systematic management of captive women with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to discuss livestock management, revealing how completely this brutalization had been integrated into normal domestic life. The scale of the longhouse system becomes clear when we examine the archaeological evidence for its geographic distribution. Excavations have revealed longhouses with underground captive facilities at sites across the entire Viking world, from Land's End Meadows in Newfoundland to Staraya Ladoga in Russia, from the Orkney Islands to the settlements along the Dnieper River. The consistency of the design features, architectural elements, and operational infrastructure suggests centralized planning and standardized construction techniques that were implemented across vast distances and multiple generations. At each site, the basic pattern is the same: impressive above-ground halls designed to project wealth and power, connected by hidden passages to extensive underground complexes designed for human imprisonment and systematic abuse. The underground facilities at different sites share architectural features that appear nowhere else in medieval construction. Specialized drainage systems, ventilation controls, acoustic dampening, and security measures that reveal sophisticated understanding of prison design and psychological conditioning. The international scope of the system is revealed through isotope analysis of skeletal remains found in longhouse disposal areas. Women buried at sites in Norway show chemical signatures indicating origins. In Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, and various regions of continental Europe. Women found at sites in Iceland show origins spanning from Greenland to the Mediterranean. The chemical evidence reveals a systematic program of human trafficking that operated on a continental scale, with established supply chains, transportation networks, and processing centers. If you value this kind of deep dive documented history, hit that subscribe button. It's the single best way to keep this channel going. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The daily reality of life inside these longhouses for captive women was a carefully orchestrated program of systematic brutalization designed to destroy their humanity while maximizing their economic value. The legal codes provide detailed schedules for every aspect of their daily lives, from wake-up times calculated to disrupt normal sleep patterns to meal schedules designed to maintain health while preventing the development of strength that might enable resistance. The morning routine began before dawn with what the legal codes euphemistically termed status confirmation, a series of ritualized humiliations designed to reinforce the captives' powerlessness and their captors' absolute authority. The captives were required to perform various degrading acts that demonstrated their complete submission: crawling to receive their food, thanking their captors for their abuse, and reciting detailed accounts of their own supposed inferiority and their captors' supposed superiority. The work assignments were designed to be simultaneously productive and psychologically destructive. Captive women were forced to produce goods for trade, textiles, metalwork, food products, and crafts, But they were also required to create items that mocked their own cultures and celebrated their captivity. Irish captives might be forced to weave tapestries depicting Viking victories over Irish kingdoms. English captives might be required to compose songs celebrating their own enslavement. The goal was to make them participate in the systematic destruction of their own cultural identity. The breeding programs represented the most systematic and calculated aspect of longhouse management. The legal codes specify that captive women designated as breeding stock were to be subjected to regular medical examinations, to monitor their fertility cycles, forced to mate with specific men according to calculated breeding schedules, and provided with specialized diets and exercise regimens designed to maximize successful pregnancies while maintaining their health for continued exploitation. The breeding facilities themselves were designed with the same attention to efficiency found in modern agricultural operations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Borg and Tiso reveals specialized chambers equipped with medical supplies, birthing equipment, and nursery facilities organized according to the perceived value of the children. The facilities included areas for pregnant women, birthing chambers, nurseries for infants, and training areas where young children were raised according to their designated future roles. Children born to captive women were classified into specific categories based on their parentage and intended use. Heir stock consisted of children whose mothers came from royal or noble families, and who might someday be used to justify territorial claims. Trade stock included children who would be sold in international slave markets when they reached appropriate ages. Work stock consisted of children who would be kept for domestic labor within the longhouse system itself. The systematic separation of children from their mothers was designed to prevent the development of emotional bonds that might interfere with efficient management. The legal codes specify that infants were to be removed from their mothers within days of birth, with contact limited to nursing sessions that were carefully monitored to prevent communication. Mothers who showed excessive attachment to their children were subjected to additional psychological conditioning designed to break these bonds. The psychological conditioning programs used in the Longhouses were remarkably sophisticated and reveal a deep understanding of human psychology applied for purely exploitative purposes. The techniques described in the legal codes would be recognizable to modern experts on trauma and mind control, systematic isolation, sleep deprivation, alternating punishment and reward, sensory manipulation, and the systematic destruction of hope and identity. The isolation techniques involved both physical and psychological separation. Captive women were housed in underground chambers where they had no contact with the outside world and limited contact with each other. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, discussing their former lives, or maintaining any connections to their pre-captivity identities. Violation of these rules resulted in increasingly severe punishments designed to condition compliance through fear. The sleep deprivation was systematic and carefully calculated. The legal codes specify that captives were to be awakened at irregular intervals throughout the night for various duties: forced labor, sexual abuse, psychological conditioning sessions, or simply harassment designed to prevent restful sleep. The goal was to keep them in a constant state of exhaustion that would make resistance impossible while maintaining enough cognitive function to perform their assigned tasks. The sensory manipulation involved control over every aspect of the captive's environmental experience. The underground chambers could be flooded with cold water, filled with nauseating smoke, subjected to extremely loud noises or complete silence, and exposed to various scents ranging from exotic perfumes that triggered memories of home to rotting organic matter that created constant nausea. The systematic use of environmental controls reveals sophisticated understanding of how sensory experience affects psychological state. The alternating punishment and reward system was designed to create psychological dependence and confusion. Captives who showed complete submission might be temporarily moved to slightly better quarters, given additional food, or allowed brief periods of relative comfort. These rewards were always temporary and unpredictable, designed to create hope that would make subsequent punishments more psychologically devastating. The economic infrastructure supporting the Longhouse system was vast and sophisticated, revealing the enormous profitability that drove its expansion and refinement. Archaeological evidence includes what appear to be accounting records that tracked the productivity and value of individual captives, shipping manifests for the transport of captive women between different sites, and detailed inventories of the goods produced through forced labor. The productivity measurements reveal the systematic exploitation of captive labor. Individual women were tracked according to their output in various categories: textile production, food processing, craft manufacturing, and sexual services. The records show careful calculation of input costs, food, housing, medical care versus output value, with detailed analysis of which types of captives provided the highest return on investment. The shipping records reveal a sophisticated logistics network that connected Longhouse sites across the Viking world. Captive women were regularly transported between different facilities based on their skills, breeding potential, market demand, and punishment requirements. The transportation network operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation, complete with scheduling systems, security protocols, and quality control measures. The international trade connections reveal the global scope of the Longhouse economy. Archaeological evidence traces trade relationships that connected Scandinavian longhouses to markets in Constantinople, Baghdad, Kiev, and North Africa. The goods produced by captive labor in remote Nordic settlements were distributed across the known world, generating enormous profits that funded further expansion of the system. The specialized roles within Longhouse management reveal the systematic organization required to operate such a complex system of human exploitation. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of professional specialists, medical personnel who maintained captive health and fertility, trainers who managed psychological conditioning programs, guards who prevented escapes and maintained security, and administrators who tracked productivity and managed logistics. The training programs for Longhouse management personnel were sophisticated and comprehensive. Legal documents describe specialized schools where young Viking men learned the techniques of human trafficking, psychological manipulation, and systematic abuse. These schools provided detailed instruction in the identification of suitable captives, methods for breaking psychological resistance, breeding management, and the ongoing administration of large-scale captive populations. The medical aspects of Longhouse management reveal a sophisticated understanding of human biology applied for purely exploitative purposes. The legal codes describe detailed protocols for maintaining the health and fertility of captive women while maximizing their productivity and minimizing their capacity for resistance. Medical personnel were trained to treat injuries and illnesses that might affect economic value, while ignoring any conditions that didn't impact productivity. The breeding management systems included detailed record keeping that tracked genetic lineages across multiple generations. Archaeological evidence includes genealogical charts that documented parentage, genetic characteristics, and planned breeding combinations, designed to produce children with specific traits for various purposes. The systematic approach to human breeding reveals long-term strategic planning that spanned decades and involved coordination across multiple sites. The disposal systems for captives who died or became unsuitable for continued exploitation reveal the systematic nature of Longhouse operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that dead captives were processed according to detailed protocols designed to maximize the recovery of useful materials while preventing contamination of living spaces. Bodies were systematically stripped of any valuable items, processed for useful materials like leather and bone, and disposed of in ways that would minimize evidence of the scale of mortality. The security measures designed to prevent escapes reveal the systematic planning that went into Longhouse construction and operation. The underground chambers were equipped with multiple layers of security: iron barriers, hidden passages that could be sealed, alarm systems that could alert guards to escape attempts, and pursuit protocols for tracking escapees. The security measures were so comprehensive that successful escapes appear to have been extremely rare. The punishment protocols for attempted escapes were designed to be so severe that they would deter other captives from similar attempts. The legal codes describe escalating punishments that began with systematic torture and escalated to public execution designed to terrorize other captives. The punishments were administered as public demonstrations within the Longhouse community, ensuring that all captives understood the consequences of resistance. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual conditioning to include systematic manipulation of relationships between captives. The legal codes describe techniques for preventing solidarity and cooperation among captives, rewarding those who informed on others, creating artificial hierarchies that pitted captives against each other, and systematically rotating individuals between different chambers to prevent the formation of supportive relationships. The cultural destruction programs were designed to systematically eliminate any connection between captives and their former identities. Captives were forced to participate in mock ceremonies that blasphemed their former religious beliefs, to create art and literature that celebrated their own subjugation, and to teach their captors techniques and knowledge from their homelands that would then be used against other members of their former communities. The systematic sexual abuse was organized according to detailed schedules and protocols designed to maximize psychological destruction while maintaining the captive's breeding potential. The legal codes specify that sexual abuse was to be used as both entertainment for Viking men and as a systematic conditioning tool for breaking psychological resistance. The abuse was often conducted as public demonstrations designed to humiliate the victims while entertaining the perpetrators. The children born in the Longhouse system faced systematic conditioning from birth designed to prepare them for their designated roles. Boys designated as future warriors were subjected to brutal training regimens that eliminated empathy and compassion. Girls designated as future captives were systematically abused to prepare them for their eventual fate. Children designated for trade were trained in skills that would increase their market value while being systematically conditioned to accept their status as property. The international adoption of Longhouse techniques reveals how successful the Viking model proved to be for systematic human exploitation. Archaeological evidence suggests that similar facilities were constructed by other cultures who had observed Viking methods. Slavic settlements along the Baltic, Norman establishments in France and England, and even some Byzantine and Islamic facilities that incorporated architectural and operational features pioneered in Scandinavian longhouses. The legal frameworks developed for longhouse management influenced slavery laws across medieval Europe and provided templates for systematic oppression that were adapted for use against various vulnerable populations. The categories and classifications developed for captive women were incorporated into legal codes across the continent, while the psychological conditioning techniques were adapted for use in various institutional settings. The resistance networks that developed among captive women reveal their courage and determination, even under the most brutal conditions. Archaeological evidence includes hidden communication systems, secret storage areas for preserved cultural items, and evidence of coordinated escape attempts that required sophisticated planning and organization. The very existence of these resistance networks demonstrates that even systematic brutalization could not completely destroy human dignity and hope. The economic records reveal that longhouse operations were so profitable they fundamentally shaped Viking society and provided the foundation for Scandinavian prosperity during the medieval period. The wealth generated through systematic human trafficking funded the expansion of Viking settlements, the construction of increasingly sophisticated facilities, and the development of international trade networks that connected Scandinavia to markets across the known world. The environmental impact of longhouse operations reveals their massive scale and industrial nature. Archaeological evidence shows systematic deforestation around longhouse sites to provide fuel for heating and construction materials for expansion. Chemical analysis of soil and water samples reveals contamination from waste products generated by large captive populations, while isotope analysis of local wildlife shows dietary changes consistent with competition for food resources from large human populations. The technological innovations developed for longhouse management were later adapted for other purposes and contributed to advances in various fields. Construction techniques developed for underground chambers influenced mining and fortification technologies. Ventilation systems designed for managing captive populations were adapted for other architectural applications. Even the systematic record keeping developed for tracking captives contributed to advances in administrative and accounting practices. The social stratification within Viking society was fundamentally shaped by involvement in longhouse operations. Archaeological evidence reveals clear distinctions between households that participated in the captive trade and those that did not, with dramatic differences in wealth, status symbols, and architectural sophistication. The longhouse system created a new aristocratic class whose power was based entirely on their ability to systematically exploit human beings. The corruption of Viking family life by longhouse practices reveals how systematic brutalization inevitably spreads beyond its intended targets. Legal documents from the later Viking period show increasing restrictions on the rights of Viking women, suggesting that techniques developed for controlling captives were being applied to domestic family relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the late Viking period, even Viking women were being subjected to some of the same systematic controls that had been developed for managing captives. The religious justifications developed for longhouse practices reveal how entire belief systems were corrupted to support systematic brutalization. Viking religious practices were modified to include rituals that celebrated the exploitation of captives and ceremonies that presented systematic abuse as religiously mandated. The corruption of religious belief to support human trafficking reveals how deeply the longhouse system had penetrated all aspects of Viking culture. The educational systems that developed around longhouse management reveal how entire generations of Viking children were systematically trained to view human exploitation as normal and desirable. Archaeological evidence suggests that longhouse sites included specialized facilities for training Viking children in the techniques of human trafficking and systematic abuse. These educational programs ensured that each generation would be more efficient and systematic in their exploitation of captive populations. The international diplomatic consequences of longhouse practices reveal how systematic human trafficking affected relationships between Viking settlements and other medieval societies. Contemporary sources describe increasing reluctance by other cultures to engage in trade or diplomatic relations with Viking societies, suggesting that knowledge of longhouse practices was contributing to international isolation and hostility. The long-term demographic impact of longhouse operations reveals their massive scale and devastating effect on European populations. Isotope analysis of burial sites across Europe shows significant population displacement and genetic disruption during the Viking period, with entire regional populations showing evidence of systematic removal of reproductive age women. The demographic evidence suggests that longhouse operations may have fundamentally altered the genetic and cultural composition of medieval Europe. The end of the longhouse system came not through moral awakening or successful resistance, but through economic and political changes that made it less profitable and sustainable. The consolidation of European kingdoms under stronger central authorities made large-scale raiding more difficult and dangerous. The Christianization of Scandinavia created new legal restrictions on the treatment of baptized captives. The development of alternative sources of wealth reduced the economic importance of human trafficking. But the most significant factor in the decline of longhouse operations was the systematic resistance that developed within Viking society itself. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing sabotage of longhouse facilities, coordinated efforts to assist escaping captives, and systematic destruction of the infrastructure that supported human trafficking. Legal documents from the later Viking period show increasing restrictions on longhouse operations and growing legal protections for all women within Viking society. The final twist in the Longhouse story reveals the ultimate fate of this systematic brutalization. It eventually consumed the society that created it. Archaeological evidence from the latest Viking period sites shows that as foreign sources of captives became scarce, the Longhouse system began to turn inward. The same underground chambers that had once housed foreign captives were increasingly filled with Viking women whose families had fallen out of political favor or who had been designated as politically inconvenient. The legal frameworks that had been developed for managing foreign captives were adapted to deal with domestic political problems. The systematic conditioning techniques that had been refined through generations of practice on foreign victims were applied to Viking women whose independence or political connections had become problematic. The breeding programs that had been designed to produce children with claims to foreign territories were turned inward to eliminate inconvenient bloodlines within Viking society itself. The architectural features that had been perfected for imprisoning foreign women were used to control Viking women who challenged established authority or violated social expectations. The psychological techniques that had been developed for breaking the spirits of foreign captives were applied to domestic women who attempted to exercise traditional feminine rights or resist arranged marriages that served political purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the end of the Viking period, the distinction between foreign captives and domestic women had largely disappeared within the Longhouse system. The same underground chambers housed both groups. The same systematic abuse was applied to both populations, and the same economic calculations determined their treatment regardless of their origins. The system that had begun as a method for exploiting foreign enemies had become a comprehensive program for controlling all women within Viking society. The final archaeological evidence reveals that the Longhouse system ultimately destroyed the very culture that created it. Skeletal remains from the latest sites show that the techniques perfected for breaking foreign women were eventually applied to the wives and daughters of the Viking elite, who had originally designed the system. The great longhouses that had symbolized Viking prosperity became prisons for the women of the very families that had built them. This is the true horror of what happened inside Viking longhouses. They weren't just homes corrupted by the presence of captive women, but comprehensive machines for the systematic destruction of human dignity that eventually consumed the entire society that created them. The archaeological evidence, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts reveal a system that became so efficient and pervasive that it ultimately proved no respecter of nationality, class, or family loyalty when power and control were at stake. The women who disappeared into Viking longhouses weren't just victims of historical brutality. They were the casualties of a system that revealed how easily domestic institutions can be transformed into instruments of systematic oppression, and how, inevitably, such systems expand to consume the very societies that create them. The longhouses that should have represented safety, family, and community became symbols of how human institutions can be corrupted to serve the systematic destruction of human worth and dignity. In the end, the story of what happened inside Viking longhouses after the raids breaks our hearts because it demonstrates that the greatest threats to human dignity often emerge not from foreign enemies, but from the systematic corruption of the most basic human institutions: our homes, our families, and our communities. When they are transformed into machines for the exploitation and control of the vulnerable. The longhouse doors that closed behind captive women didn't just trap individuals. They marked the transformation of entire societies into systems dedicated to the systematic destruction of human worth.